Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with this program. My iPhone says it's 3:20, so I'm sure all yours say it's 3:20 also. That's the starting time. So we have official confirmation of the starting time. My name is Ken Strobeck. I'm the Executive Director of the League of Arizona Cities and Towns. I want to welcome you to this program. It's the League 2018 Legislative Report and look ahead to the 2019 legislative session. And just want to remind you that all the handouts are available in your app, and also biographical information on the speakers is there as well. Please put your cell phones on mute or vibrate or something like that, please. And our speakers today, I'm going to start off the program, and I have to leave after a few minutes because I have to staff another committee, so nothing personal, but I am leaving the program in excellent hands with Nick Ponder, our Legislative Director, to my immediate left, Tom Savage, Legislative Associate, and Alex Vidal, League Legislative Associate also. And so we'll get through the program, and then if you have questions, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll have some discussion. Also, this program is available for CLE credits if you are an attorney. There's a sign-up sheet in the back of the room. You can sign up for that. And we have to have at least 5 of you do that in order for it to be valid as a CLE session. So you can take a look at that. There's a handout to take with you that outlines what the program is. You see that we have some elected officials with us in the room. Representative Blanc, Representative Powers-Hanley, Senator Kavanaugh, a number of legislative staff, and a whole passel of lobbyists. So we're going to be kept real honest up here today. Make sure that if anything we say, we will get the tomatoes on our faces, I'm sure. But we're here to recap what happened at the legislative session in 2018 from the perspective of cities and towns. And we always like to start off this program with sort of the session at a glance. This is sort of the statistics of the session. And the legislature adjourned this year, sine die, on May 4th, technically May 3rd, the wee hours of the night. That was 116 days into the session. That's pretty close to the 100-day target that they try to go for. A little bit shorter than last year by just a few days. There was a one-day special session in the middle of all this to deal with opioid legislation, and the general effective date, 90 days after adjournment, so the general effective date for bills was August 3rd. So unless there's a delayed effective date or unless there was an emergency clause, the general effective date was August 3rd. 1,208 proposed new regulations. Remember, this is a group of folks that don't like government regulation, so I always say that the one thing, we don't need 1,200 more laws, thank you, but this is actually interesting because we take a look at the number of bills that are passed. It's far fewer, obviously. 370 bills were sent to the governor, and 347 of those were signed. He did 23 vetoes, but that's really a misleading figure because one day during budget negotiations, the legislature sent 10 bills up to the governor, and he vetoed all 10 of those bills with one single veto letter saying, I'm not signing any bills until you send me a budget, and regardless of what the bills were. And but they kind of had a little deal worked out, so when those bills got back to the legislature, they were all repassed, and he signed them the second time. So the actual true number of vetoes is 13. And the league staff tracked more than 200 bills this year. There's always a lot of bills that have to do with cities and towns, and what our process is during the first few weeks of the session as bills are being dropped, we get printed versions of those delivered every afternoon, and the league staff sits around a table, and we go through every single one of those bills and review them and see is there any impact on city revenue, on city authority, on any city personnel issues, anything like that, and if so, then we put it in a category and we start tracking those bills. And you can follow what we track on our website. We have a bill tracking link there so that you can actually see the bills that we are tracking and see where their progress is in the legislative process. Representative Gabaldon has joined us. All right, the major legislative issues this year, this is not necessarily cities and towns, but sort of the dominant themes of the legislature. Number one, I have to put up there teacher pay. That was the one that was just the 800-pound gorilla, but what's interesting to remember is that really didn't show up until just the last few weeks of the session when the Red for Ed movement sort of caught fire, and all of a sudden our parking lot was jammed with cars. All the other surface lots were full, and there were people in red T-shirts all over the Capitol, in the galleries, in committee rooms, in the areas, the open areas. And what was amazing is they didn't leave. Even at late into the day, they were still there. The rooms were still full. So it was very clear that this was an organization, basically an organic movement that had a great deal of intensity. And it certainly got some results, so we'll talk about that in a minute. Digital goods, this was another major theme that really was sort of going on through the entire length of the session. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. VLT and HERF funds, this got linked into the teacher pay issue, and also, actually, there's some good news on that front as far as we're concerned regarding HERF. The one-day special session on opioids did result in legislation that limits the dose and supply of certain opioids, boosts regulation of clinics, and requires naloxone to be prescribed along with certain opioids. So that was basically all that was accomplished in that one-day special session, so some bills to deal with that. And then the other thing that was an interesting issue was the matter of school safety, because right at the session began right about the time the Parkland High School shootings happened down in Florida. So there was a great deal of discussion about, we got to do something about guns, and the folks on the Second Amendment side said, no, you can't do that part of it. And so there were a lot of bills and ideas introduced, and a great deal of discussion, a great deal of, we've got to do something, and at the end of the day, absolutely nothing happened. There was no bill passed on it whatsoever. But regardless, there was a significant amount of discussion. Now, the other interesting thing to remember, I know this seems like it happened years ago, at least to me, is that the beginning of this session, 2018, was dominated by investigations into sexual harassment at the legislature, and the investigation ongoing that ended up resulting in the House actually expelling Representative Don Shooter and sending him out of the legislature for having violated rules of the House. Now, there's always a second act in politics, so he's gone back, he's collected signatures, he's on the ballot to be elected again back to the state Senate, so we'll see what happens there. But I mean, it all seems like that was so long ago. I don't know if those folks who experienced that feel that same way, but to us on the outside, it seems like that was just years and years ago. All right, the focus of the League, these are always pretty much the themes that we have. It's our two priorities, our two core values, defense of local decision-making, and we're not even going to call it local control. It's just let cities do the work that they do best at the local level. Let cities govern themselves, and then protection of our shared revenue system, because that is so important to making sure that we have stable finances in order to deliver for our citizens. Also, we try over and over, and have increased in recent years, to be a honest broker and provide reliable data. To that end, we have actually done research reports, we've had study committees, we've had groups that we've contracted with to do data and research for us, so that when we go to the legislature, we're actually saying, here's the facts. You may be hearing that, everybody does this, everybody does that. Here's the facts. Here's how many cities are doing this. Here's what the impact is of that, so that when we go, we are actually armed with data rather than just anecdotes. Because, as you all know, we do not participate, or we're not even engaged in the financial contribution business, so we don't have any influence in terms of saying we'll give you a big contribution for your campaign. But our data, our information is our currency, and we rely on actually getting that data back from cities and towns. We do a lot of pre-session work. We try to see which issues are likely to be coming forward and do some research and information on that. Of course, we always focus on our resolutions. We'll talk about last year's resolutions and the outcome of those, and then any additional bills. There's always others that we didn't see coming that just pop up, and so we have to be prepared for that. I want to tell you one little anecdote. One of our staff met with a particular member, and he said, well, it's going to be a rough year for cities. And the response was, well, yeah, they're all kind of rough. And he said, yeah, this is going to be particularly rough. And I just want to say to those in attendance who are members of the legislature, we shouldn't have rough years for cities. We should be working together. We're all representing the interests of the citizens of the state of Arizona, and so thank you. I think it's really good when we're able to get on the same wavelength and to say we're not in a combat situation. We don't need to be trying to cut the legs off of either side. What we're there is to do the very best public policy and get things done for our citizens. All right, let's start off with a look at some of the big budget issues. And of course, this was really the big story, is the HERF bill, Senate Bill 1529. Now, I have to link back and talk a little bit about this in the context of teacher pay, because for a long time, the League has actually, originally, the Governor Ducey proposed something along these lines when he was first elected, was why don't we do a fee on vehicle licenses, vehicle license tax, that we call it a safety fee, and then we can actually use that money to fund DPS, and then we don't have to do the sweeps of HERF money to backfill the DPS, and we can eliminate the HERF sweeps. Well, the legislature is not a big fan of imposing new taxes or even fees that can be sometimes characterized as taxes, and so while we thought that was a great idea, it didn't go very far, and the idea has been back a time or two since then, but it still hasn't gone very far. Well, it was introduced this year both in the House and the Senate. Representative Campbell and Senator Worsley both introduced bills that would do essentially that, and some of our folks were over saying to various members that we think this is a good idea and this would eliminate the HERF sweeps. Well, it didn't get too far until the Red for Ed people came down there, and Governor Ducey had sort of a change of heart. If you remember, his original budget proposed a 1% increase in pay for teacher salaries, and he was on the record as saying 1% is enough, that's fair. We did Prop 123, 1% is all they're going to get. And so then along came this enormous movement with all these red T-shirts, and I can just kind of imagine the conversation that was going on the 9th floor when I can just hear Governor Ducey say, well, did I say 1%? I meant 20%. And there was definitely a sense that there was some political momentum here and something had to be done, and so that 1% quickly became 20% by 2020. And so then the next question that was asked by legislators was, okay, where do we get the money? All of a sudden, what about that idea that was let's increase the VLT and put a safety fee on there? How about if we not only do that, but we even add more to that, and then it becomes more money for education, for teachers, as well as for eliminating HERF sweeps by funding DPS. And amazingly, that's what happened. The Senate ended up passing that. I believe it was by a 1-vote margin, but you know, it's close, only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades, but one vote did it, and passed in the House, and lo and behold, we had the new safety fee with enough money to backfill or pay for DPS, which meant that they could back out a lot of the sweeps out of HERF. So the HERF sweeps this year actually dropped from 99 million down to 15 million. Now remember, this is only a half year because we're talking about the half of the fiscal year, and this is a very complex slide, but if you look at it, it ends up with the HERF is split between the State Highway Fund, cities, towns, and counties, and so there was 42 million for State Highway, 42 million for cities and towns, and 21 million additional for cities and towns out of a second account. So the bottom line is, at the end of the day, the HERF sweep was dramatically reduced, and you should all be seeing more HERF dollars flowing through to your communities, and we have the legislature to thank for that, and the teachers in a sense, because they helped get the momentum behind that funding mechanism, and there will also be dollars left over to go toward education funding. So that was a significant improvement, and one that we have actually worked on for more than 15 years to try to get rid of this sweep of HERF funds. And I just heard the governor say that he's committed to making sure we'll never sweep HERF funds again. So, hopefully that will carry forward. Some additional budget items. Senate Bill 1522. This was another piece of good news. It actually put some money back into the State Aviation Fund for grants for municipal airports. Senate Bill 1523 allows funds from the Concealed Weapons Permit Fund to be used for police officer training, and that's, of course, a big expense for cities and towns. So we're actually seeing some things turn around from the recession-plagued years of the mid-2000s. Then this last item is the bad news. Senate Bill 1529 still is requiring a contribution of about $21 million from cities, towns, counties, and 2 COGs to fund the operations of the Department of Revenue. And this is something that is very irritating to us because we believe a state agency should be operated with state funds, but it's one of those things that was kind of a leftover from the recession years, and it hasn't gone away. We would like it to go away, and that's a significant amount of dollars. All right, let's talk about the digital goods bill. There were 2 bills, one in the House, one in the Senate. Last session in the interim, there was a digital goods and services ad hoc committee that was assembled to take a look at the way that we tax online transactions, digital transactions and sales. And as you know, there's been some other developments lately regarding the Wayfair case in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. But what these digital goods bills basically did, or let me say that the committee issued a report at the end of the day that said what we should probably do is go ahead and have a bill that simply codifies the practices that we're currently doing with DOR and with the Model City Tax Code, and that is revenue neutral. And that's not a bad idea. So they said there's a lot of things that are not in statute that probably should be in statute to just nail down the practices that are currently going on in DOR and in the cities. And so when we looked at the bills after they came out, it was, wow, this doesn't do that at all. This actually creates 8 new exemptions that would eliminate the taxation of a lot of digital transactions, and this is very significant because these are things that we are currently taxing. So that would be a significant reduction in revenue. And some of the examples of things would be such things as TurboTax. Let's say you use TurboTax for your taxes. The way the bill was written, if you went out and bought a copy of TurboTax, you pay retail transaction privilege tax on that. If you downloaded it entirely and put it on your PC, you would pay transaction tax on that. But if you used it online, even if you prepared your tax return and printed it out and everything, that was virtual. You weren't really using anything. That was in the cloud, so there would be no tax on that. And our position was that doesn't make a lot of sense because as far as we're concerned, that's exactly the same transaction because you're using data, you're using bits and bytes that are measurable, and this is essentially a retail transaction. Also, we tax rental of certain items, and so by the same token, if you went to a Blockbuster Video, if you could find one, and rented a DVD, you would pay rental tax. You'd pay tax on that. Or if you downloaded a movie in its entirety, you would pay tax on that. But this bill said if you streamed that movie on Netflix or on Amazon or any of the other services, you would not pay any tax. That would be absolutely free, again, because you're not really doing anything. It doesn't really exist. And again, our position was this is the same transaction. It should be taxed exactly the same way because as more and more things go online and digitally, this is the way the the economy is going into the future, and this is creating a level playing field. Now, I want to distinguish between streaming on demand and other kind of streaming content like Sling TV or Direct TV. Those things, you just turn on your device and you get whatever is being broadcast, and that is not taxable. We understood that and we agreed to that. But when it's an on-demand, then that's like a rental, and so we said that was taxable. But we couldn't get either JLBC or DOR to actually issue a fiscal report about what the impact of that was, and we were very concerned about that. So we did some of our own analysis, pulled data from the cities that used to be self-collecting cities, and saw how much of their tax revenues were coming from these various sources, and then we went ahead and extrapolated that toward the state and Prop 301 and other sources, and we calculated that in our numbers it was about $160 million revenue hit if this bill was to be passed in its current form. And it had already passed the House, and it was poised to pass the Senate when our numbers came out, and we got a real backlash from certain interests who were pushing this bill, and they said, your numbers are totally wrong. And we said, well, we kind of said that there's a little fudge factor. We don't have the data that you have at the state level, but this is the best we can do, and if you don't think our numbers are good, where are your numbers? Well, we don't have any numbers, but your numbers are wrong. And so we felt like we had solid data, and again, trying to use data and give legislators information about the impact of bills they were proposing. At the end of the day, this bill did not pass, but we fully expect it'll be back next year, and in fact, we need to have something back next year to establish this economic threshold that the U.S. Supreme Court said needs to be in place in order to enact a digital goods transaction, online sales, etc. So it was a very long story. We thought it was interesting. I hope you thought it was a little bit interesting. But again, at the end of the day, we also said we will go ahead and draft our own version of the bill that does what the committee said they wanted. So we drafted our bill that had current practices and revenue neutral, but that did not succeed. All right, moving on, prime contracting. This is an issue that has been around for years. Those of you that have been in the legislature are going to roll your eyes at this, but hopefully this is the last time you'll have to see this issue. You remember we've had MRRA, the MRRA system in place for some time, and there's been complaints about, well, handyman shouldn't have to register, and we don't know where the lines are, if it's alteration or remodeling and so forth. And so we ended up having a bill that excludes contractors that qualify for the Registrar of Contractors handyman license. If you're a handyman, you don't have to do construction contracting tax at all. You just pay retail tax on the materials that you use if you are really a handyman. But if you are in the business of alteration for commercial properties, for projects, we remove the limit of not more than 40% of the existing footprint being impacted and not more than 10% of added square footage, because people were saying that's too hard to calculate. And instead, that's replaced with a bright line that says if it's 25% of the full cash value for residential, if your project equals 25% or more, or if it's over $750,000 for a commercial project, then you're in the contracting business and you pay prime contracting tax on that. If you're under that bright line, then you pay retail tax on materials. And so hopefully that this will work. Actually, this idea came from the construction industry. Do we get moved around a little here? All right. It actually came from the construction industry, and they had credibility with a number of members of the legislature, and so this bill passed, and we were in support, and so we hope that this will make things easier going forward and bring more predictability to the whole system. All right, and then I'm going to wrap up my portion of this presentation talking about home-based businesses. This was another really fascinating bill. Again, we had one of these in the House, one of these in the Senate, and the one in the Senate didn't get too far, the one in the House did, and then it died, and then it was resurrected with a strike everything, and it got back over to the House. I mean, the saga was endless on this, but basically there was a strong amount of interest, particularly from from the Goldwater Institute to have people be able to operate businesses out of their homes, even in residential areas. Now, we fully acknowledge that there are thousands of people operating businesses out of their homes in residential areas, and there's no problem. They're doing it all the time. They're doing various services, and especially, you know, eBay sellers and accountants and all those kinds of things, and it's not a problem. The only time it gets to be a problem is when people kind of expand, or they're a nuisance to their neighbors, or in the case of one community where a guy applied for a business to do mobile car repair. The next thing you knew, he had a couple of hoists out in his front yard, and he was actually doing car repairs out there at all hours of the night and with lights and everything. That's when the city gets involved and goes out and says, wait a minute, you're zoned residential, you can't do that. Well, the Goldwater Institute had an example of somebody they felt was harmed in a particular city, and so they came out very forcefully and said, everyone has an absolute right, and property right, to operate a business out of your home in a residential area. And, you know, if you can imagine that, maybe one on a block is okay, but what if there are 7 or 8 of these auto repair places in a block? It's not a residential area anymore. And when you talk about property rights, what about the property rights of those people who bought a residential home in a residential area and expect to have peace and quiet in their homes and not be, having to live next door to a commercial business? So I mean, there's an issue that goes around with that particular discussion, and so. Again, we fought this over and over, back and forth. At the end of the day, this bill did not pass, but this, again, is one of those that there's still a lot of noise out there and emails and things going back and forth, so I expect that something like this is going to come back again. But I think if we can maybe get to the point of saying that these folks who want peace and quiet in their neighborhoods also have some rights, and, again, we're not involved in bothering people. We don't go out and knock on doors and say you can't operate your business. It's only when they become an annoyance to their neighbors and their neighbors call the city and say you got to do something about it that we get involved. All right, I'm going to pass the mic.
So I'm just going to kick this off real quick and say that Ken is going to depart and he has to go to another session, but the three of us are going to carry forward and talk about the rest of the slides. Although we all know about each of these bills, we're going to bounce around a little bit to those that actually specialized on them. So we're going to start off with Tom on food trucks.
Yes, thanks, Nick. And just by way of background, I'm Tom Savage. This is is this on? All right, this is I just finished up my second legislative session at the League, and prior to that I was at the state legislature. So worked on a number of bills during my career in legislative affairs, but none more interesting or unique than food truck regulations. So I think probably some of you have heard about this bill. It kind of received quite a lot of media attention, both when it was first dropped at the legislature and then when it was eventually signed by Governor Ducey and given the moniker the Food Truck Freedom Bill. So at first glance, when we were working through the provisions of this bill, we were kind of scratching our heads trying to figure out, well, where is this bill coming from? And so we quickly found out that this was a bill that was being proposed by the Institute for Justice. And this is one of the groups that we sometimes spar with at the Capitol on issues with regard to local decision-making, local control. They've taken up this issue because they see local regulation or some cities that have ordinances as anti-competitive regulations. And so they've taken up this issue in Arizona and in other states as well. So when we met with the sponsor on this particular issue, and met with the stakeholders to try to get a sense of what issue is trying to be solved here. So the sponsor conveyed his concerns, and he also reiterated to us, he is a food truck owner, and he's doing this on behalf of the industry that he works for. So we sat down with him and many of the stakeholders that are pretty active in the food truck scene in the Phoenix area, and they kind of shared their concerns about the patchwork of regulations between one city or another. So, for instance, in the town of Gilbert, that's pretty friendly to the food truck scene. They do not enforce any of the what's called keep moving laws, which require food truck vendors to move after 1 or 2 hours. They have pretty light restrictions on parking. They, in fact, only restrict food trucks at a particular location. They can't be there for longer than 96 hours. So they provided a few examples of some of the challenges that they face when they move from one city to another, because it's not like the ice cream trucks or the push carts that have a really small footprint for where they're serving customers. These food trucks are moving from city to city and county to county, going to various food truck events or even just to commercial developments to serve customers. And so what we conveyed, we at the same time conveyed our concerns, because when we took a look at the provisions of the bill, it took a pretty hard stance on local regulation. In fact, it was pretty much unfettered use of parking spaces, both in the right-of-way and in and just private parking lots. Food truck vendors didn't have to get a license, they didn't have to get background checks, they didn't have to have permits. So it was essentially you just get your food safety license from the county. After that, you can show up in any city or town. You don't have to have a permit, and you're free to operate. So we conveyed our obvious concerns about that preemption of local control, and so after many different derivations of this particular issue, we finally landed on what we think was a balanced approach to providing the vendors, the food truck vendors, that streamlined framework and consistent regulation that they were looking for, but doing so without tying the hands of local officials to go after, say, the bad actors in the industry that are dumping grease down storm drains or taking up parking spaces, being at locations for a significant amount of time, and therefore skirting zoning and building code requirements. So what we left with was the bill establishes a statewide license that they get where their commissary is located. So if they're located in Maricopa County, they go to Maricopa County Health Department, they get their license, they can operate consistently in the other 14 counties. Cities and towns, we get to enforce our current regulations and zoning codes unless there's been restricted by the law. This restrictions in residential areas still are maintained, and at various public facilities such as public airports and public transit facilities. So in other words, we're not going to be seeing any food trucks pulling up to Terminal 4 at Sky Harbor and start serving customers there. They'll probably have to go to the cell phone lot. But other than that, moving forward, we're working on trying to find a streamlined approach to as cities and towns begin to draft their ordinances to comply with this new law. We're looking at examples in other states to kind of see what they're doing and what we can incorporate here in Arizona to comply with this new law.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Alex Vidal, Legislative Associate with the League of Cities and Towns. Like Tom, I just finished up my second session at the legislature, and before that I was also an analyst in the Senate, actually. Can you all hear me? No? I'll try and project then. Is that better? I'll use my opera voice. The bill that I wanted to talk about today deals with occupational licensing. So this is a bill that was also introduced last year. What it did was it would have eliminated our ability to establish new occupational licenses. At the local level, we don't have a lot of occupational licenses. We tend to do things that are too small for the state to license. So the best example is, for example, exotic dancers. We license exotic dancers to make sure that we're not letting people operate that have a history of prostitution or drug charges, of things of that nature. We also license peddlers and door-to-door salesmen, the things that might create a problem for fraud or for just create a public safety hazard. I don't see the state setting up a department to license exotic dancers. It's just too small for the state government to do. So we do it at the local level to make sure that our residents are safe. the way that the bill approached the issue was it would have frozen our ability to do licenses. So in, let's say, Phoenix, where they do have a peddler's license and an exotic dancer license, the city or town next door that doesn't have a current license, they wouldn't be able to establish a license as they grow as a city or town. And so what it would have done is create a situation where folks would have gone from a city or town that does license and moved into other cities and towns that don't license, because we wouldn't have been able to establish a license at that point. We thought it was bad public policy. It was being promoted by a think tank from Georgia, and so we were able to defeat that bill last year and this year. But Representative Payne introduced another bill that kind of took a similar tack. It would have prohibited us from licensing specific occupations. They had a list there, but that would have created a precedent where the state legislature could come back every year and just add to the list things that we can't license. So, but we did work with Representative Payne to come to an agreement where the licenses that we have on the books now, we've got to review them within the next 5 years, and then every 5 years thereafter. So it creates a little bit of transparency, so that we're not just creating licenses willy-nilly, but there's a review process on the books and a requirement to do that. So that bill did pass, and it speaks to the fact that a lot of times we're accused of not working collaboratively with state lawmakers on issues. We've been accused of just saying no to everything, but this is proof positive that we do, in fact, try to reach agreements whenever possible when it makes sense for our residents.
And just to that point, if I can piggyback on what Alex said, as a result of this occupational licensing 5-year review, one of our cities in particular has reviewed their occupational licenses and determined that they're going to get rid of 2 licenses. So something like this is sort of forcing some of our cities to look back at some of the things that they've done before, and they say, okay, this is sort of archaic and we don't need it. And so in that way, and for that particular city, it's been helpful.
Yes, thank you. Next bill that I want to talk about is with regard to licensing of cable operators. Now, from the start of this bill and through the duration of session, it was kind of a contentious issue. And while we don't like to be at odds with one of our utility partners that we work closely with, it was a pretty challenging issue to work with when one of your partners brings you a 24-page piece of legislation during the second week of session with no stakeholder process prior to that, that really changes the face of the way that cable operators are regulated in the state. Now, as you know, cities, counties have, for the entire existence of cable television, licensed cable operators in the right-of-way. Both the FCC and the federal government has delegated this authority to what they call a local franchising authority, because the service that's provided is provided in a localized area, including, they're cutting up streets, they're doing pole attachments in the right-of-way. So the federal government recognized that cities and towns are better positioned to ensure that their construction practices are not going to have an impact on the surrounding community. So it was a bit of a challenge to see this bill really change the face of how cable TV is regulated here in Arizona. What it initially established was a certificate of authority that would be housed at the Secretary of State's office. Now, the first issue with that is Secretary of State doesn't have any oversight of utilities in the state. It would be better positioned, or the Corporation Commission would actually be better positioned to oversee this, because competitive telephone is already regulated by CorpCom. The filings that cable operators do are already at the Corporation Commission. So it would just make better sense, in our opinion, that the Corporation Commission also have oversight over licensing of cable operators if it was going to go to a statewide framework. So our initial, and that was one of our big concerns. And the other provisions in the bill that were of particular concern with regard to shifting costs for street repair and undergrounding of their cable plant. So essentially in the bill, it would allow for them to subjectively decide what costs that they were going to cover with regard to street repair. So if they come in, they do a pavement cut to access one of their utilities, one of their facilities in the right-of-way, repair the street, they can essentially pay for the cost that they want to pay for while passing that cost on to the cities and towns, which would essentially be an offset to their license fees that they pay to the local governments for the privilege of being in the right-of-way. So that provision in particular was very concerning. It was eventually struck out of the bill early on in the process, but some of the other provisions regarding where the licensing was housed, that was a pretty contentious issue. Ultimately, it ended up back at the city and town that's issuing a uniform video service license. So essentially, all the cable operator does is they come to your city clerk, fill out paperwork. You have a certain amount of days to process that application, and they receive a license. It doesn't go to your council for a vote. It's just an automatic approval. If they've checked all the boxes and filled out the application in proper form, then you are required to issue them a license to operate in your right-of-ways. And so a number of other issues with this bill, including that within 2 years, if any of the incumbent cable operators in your jurisdiction have a current license, they will be able to terminate that agreement regardless of how many years left in that license they have. So if they had a 10-year license with you with 7 years left, they can pull out of that agreement and go get this uniform video service license. Anybody who remains operating under their license that doesn't opt to terminate their license, they become a holdover cable operator and will just continue to operate under their license until it expires. So this bill is essentially effective in 2 years. So cities and towns are going to have to draft what the uniform video service license is going to look like, the standard terms and conditions. There's probably going to need to be some changes to your code to reflect the right-of-way ordinances that normally would have been included in your license that will have to be placed now in your code. So we are assisting with working with the State Telegram Group. We're trying to assist those communities who may be struggling with trying to figure out what's the next step that we take in order to comply with this new law. So with that.
And to Tom's point, as he said at the very beginning, we don't like to be at odds with our utilities in particular. Both Tom and I have met with the cable licensing group since the end of session. One of the things that, to their credit, that they agreed to do going forward is that they're going to have their legislative agenda setting in September as opposed to the end of November, which doesn't give us a lot of time to have stakeholder discussions because they dropped the bill at the end of January. So they've agreed to that to sort of help out in any scenario that we might have where there might be concerns. And Tom's doing a lot of work right now on trying to resolve some of the unresolved issues that came out of that bill from last year. Now, I'm going to talk about Senate Bill 1487. Save for Mayor Kavanaugh and Mr. Kavanaugh in the back, how many people in this room know what 1487 is? Okay, not all of us know, so I'm just going to go through a quick refresher. And quite frankly, in my meetings with legislators up until this point, there are several legislators that have no idea what 1487 is. So I'm going to go with a little bit of background. This was a Senator Andy Biggs law several years ago that allows any legislator to make a claim against a city or county that says that the city or county is violating state law. The origin of this actually dates back to Bisbee's plastic bag law. For those of you that don't know, several years ago, Bisbee passed an ordinance that effectively outlawed plastic bags, and everybody was either using their own disposable bags or reusable bags, or paper. Some folks at the legislature didn't like that. They thought that Bisbee was operating outside of the law. Bisbee said, we're a charter city. It's in our charter. We believe that we're operating inside of the law. And so the legislature passed a law that allows any legislator to make a claim against a city, and the Attorney General's office must take that up immediately. The Attorney General's office has 30 days basically after the response from the city. It's actually a relatively quick timeline to make a determination, and they have 3 determinations that they can make. One is that the ordinance does not violate the law, one is that it may violate the law, and one is that it does violate the law. In a may violate, the Attorney General can then request that that goes immediately to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court makes a determination on that. In a does violate, the city must repeal, or county, must repeal their ordinance within 30 days or they give up 6 months' worth of shared revenue. So and if you look at some of the charts on the league website, I think about 40% of city budgets are attributable to shared revenue. So that's quite a bit of money to give up in these scenarios. Our challenge was that in a may violate scenario, we don't, as a city, have, in a does violate scenario, we as a city don't have access to the Supreme Court just like the Attorney General's office does or the legislature does. Bisbee, again, was found that they did violate. Bisbee is a town of 5,500 people, give or take, and they couldn't afford to give up shared revenue. They also couldn't afford the attorney's fees that would have been required to fight this battle, and so they had to repeal their ordinance. We've had a problem with this law as cities for several years, and there are multiple reasons. But one reason that's come about more recently is that the legislator that makes the claim does not need to represent the district or the city in which they make a claim against. So, for example, I think we've had 11 claims, and 10 of them have come from people outside of their district. The claim against Bisbee was made by Warren Peterson, who's a senator out in LD 12, if I'm not mistaken. This is a challenge, and for those of you that follow the Capitol, in the last month, a legislator has asked somebody else to make a claim on their behalf so that they weren't accountable to their district. So what we did is we drafted a bill that would have required the legislator to have any piece of that city within their district. The one claim that was made by somebody that represents the city was Mark Fincham's claim against Tucson for the melting of guns, basically. He has a small portion of Tucson that he represents, but nonetheless he represents Tucson, and that was the one opportunity where somebody actually represented their district. What we asked was that the legislator have to represent in some way, some form, the city in which they're making a claim against. We also asked for access to the courts. So we wanted access to the Supreme Court, and it does violate. And what that means is that it immediately goes to the Supreme Court, and we can get a stay on having to give up 6 months of shared revenue. We also asked that the timelines be extended, and that was something that the actual Attorney General's office wanted as well. The timelines for submitting the paperwork and submitting the responses need to be extended. Unfortunately, this bill did not actually even get out of committee this past session, but I have been meeting with legislators. For those of you that don't know, I became the legislative director in June, and so I've been meeting with a lot of legislators since June to discuss 1487. For those that are unaware, make them aware of it. For those that are aware, inform them about why we don't like it, what we would like to see change to it, and also why we might be somewhat averse to some of these bills that could risk 1487 claims in the future. Ken talked about home-based businesses, for example. A perfect one that I can think of is Sedona had a business license for short-term rentals. Now, when we were talking about short-term rentals with the legislature years ago, we in fact had a meeting with the Goldwater Institute, and the individual in the room representing Goldwater at the time said they had no problem with the city running a business, having a business license. Now, the reason that a city might want to do this, I'm sure you're all aware, is Again, if I know where the short-term rentals are, my police force can then know where they are. And if I get a call about suspicious activity in the neighborhood at such and such house, my police force can respond to that a little bit differently than they would a home where there is no short-term rental. Nevertheless, a claim was made against Sedona a couple of years after the law passed and after everybody said they were okay with it. And an individual at the Attorney General's office determined that we were in violation of the law and he compared short-term rentals to long-term rentals. Now, we're not allowed to require a business license of residential rentals, but we believe short-term rentals are more akin to hotels. They're for transient lodging. People are only staying there for a few days or a week or maybe a little bit longer. So we believe that the comparison was inaccurate. Nevertheless, the law, they were found in violation, and Bisbee had to repeal their business license requirement. So there are challenges with this law. We would like some modifications to it, and I've been speaking with members of the legislature about that, and some of them have been receptive. So we'll again make these efforts in subsequent sessions. I'm going to move on to post-traumatic stress. And by the way, there's a lot of slides here. The slides are available on your app, I believe, and online. So we're probably going to breeze through some of these other ones. PTSD counseling was one of the bills that I worked on. When this bill came out, and I think from a city perspective, we're relatively close to our police and fire officials. We work with them all the time. In some cases, they're our neighbors. In some cases, they're our council members. And they're our friends. So we obviously are sensitive to post-traumatic stress disorder as it relates to police and fire personnel. However, when this bill first came out, it was the most expansive bill in the country. It was the most costly bill in the country, and we needed to make some modifications to that. The modifications, unfortunately, and by the way, there was very little stakeholder process through the House, but there was more robust stakeholder process in the Senate, and we were grateful for that. And with this bill, I think we found something that blends the needs of our police and fire personnel as we become more aware of mental health issues and post-traumatic stress disorder. It allows them to get the treatment that they need and then return to work in a healthy state. But it also balances that with the cities being stewards of taxpayer dollars and trying to figure out what is the proper protocol to help these guys out. So I'm very thankful to Representative Boyer and Senator Gray for helping us get this bill through, and that's all I'm going to say on PTSD. Oh, actually, let me just say, we did do a bill 2 years ago that allowed 12 visits for mental health issues. We expanded it to 36 visits. We provided some protections for what types of mental health professionals that they can use. But more importantly, we required data to be reported on this. What this allows us to do is to review the data and not come back next year with new legislation. It allows us to wait until we actually have information. As Ken said, we want to be, we want to use fact more than anecdote. So if we can get data and facts that represent either our side or their side, then we can more adequately come to the table and have discussion about what needs to be done going forward.
Thanks, Nick. So I'm just going to focus on the first bill here about sober living homes. We appreciate Representative Fincham sponsoring one of our resolutions. That's that second bill. I'll let you read about that online. Sober living homes have been an issue in Arizona for a few years now. Basically, we have no regulations before 2016, so a lot of for-profit operations were setting up essentially flop houses and inviting folks that needed drug treatment, needed a sober living environment from out of state or from in-state, and just doing it for the profits and not really doing it with the person's health in mind. So a couple years ago, Representative Noel Campbell passed a bill that gave cities and towns the ability to license these homes. Unlike local licensing, this is an issue that's too big for cities to handle on their own. Cities don't generally handle health care, health service issues. We do public health issues. Somebody's pool is infested with mosquitoes. You call the city and they'll take care of it. But we don't handle individual healthcare type issues. And so we worked this year with Department of Health Services to establish a statewide licensing system. So Department of Health Services will now be licensing all sober living homes throughout the state. Starting next year, they're required that any referral to a sober living home from the government or from a from a health insurance provider will have to be for a home that's licensed, either certified, through the national or the Arizona chapter of the Recovery Residents Association. And so until Department of Health Services can finalize their rules for licensing homes in the state, we've been asked by our members to work with Department of Health Services to expedite that process, to speed up that process. They do have the authority to use an expedited rulemaking process. They've hinted to us that they're not going to be using that it's going to be more work for them, but we're going to be at the table pushing them to speed up the rulemaking process so that we can make sure that sober living homes in Arizona are a model for the country, so that we're helping folks in our state that need these services, and that if folks from out of state are coming here, they're getting proper services and not just being abandoned in one of our cities or towns.
Okay, so the next bill I'm going to talk about just really briefly, this was proposed as a resolution last session and was just additionally approved again at the Resolutions Committee at this conference. House Bill 2182, what this would have allowed, or just by way of background actually, in 2016 as part of the campaign finance reform, there was an amendment that was put on one of the two bills that was running through the process that prohibited candidates that had city and town accounts from moving that up to a statewide or a legislative office. So there really wasn't any portability for these campaign funds, but if a statewide or legislative officer wanted to move to a county seat or to their city and town seat, they can make those campaign dollars portable into those campaign accounts. So really what we saw was this was an issue of fairness, that city and town, what we really want to see is city and town officials that have experience in local government and understand the nuanced issues that oftentimes go to the legislature. They should be able to seek higher office and use those campaign dollars to fund their election. So essentially what this would allow for is for that portability of those campaign funds. And so again, this was approved as a resolution at the annual conference, so we will be seeking legislation to fix this matter. The next bill on the list in regard to streetlight improvement districts, this was simply just a good governance bill, and we want to thank Senator Kavanaugh in the background for running the bill for us. What this would allow for is the consolidation of the numerous streetlight improvement districts. Some communities have over hundreds, 200, 300. It's an administrative burden because each one has to have their own tax levy and has to go to council. It's usually on a consent agenda, but nonetheless, city and town staff have to budget for each of these numerous SLID districts. So we hope that moving forward, this bill will allow for the streamline of this service that we provide to our residents.
Thanks, Tom. So by way of background, every year the liquor industry gets together and they write a single bill, this is the liquor omnibus, to try and work out issues that they have amongst themselves. But for the last few years, they've come to the league to try and work out a compromise, an agreement with us to make sure that we're not fighting throughout session. And so most of what they do is really industry specific, and it doesn't really affect cities and towns, but there are obviously some public safety issues related to licensing. We were able to work with them this last year to get one of our resolutions approved to allow approval of special event licenses so that our clerks can do that. Just it makes their life easier. But because of the work that we've done over the last couple of years to improve that relationship, we're going to be able to do some proactive work that we want to get done regarding the state liquor board. That was some things that we want to do next year, and they've been very supportive of the changes that we want to make because of that relationship that we've been able to improve and work on with the industry. the next bill we'll talk about, I'll just talk about the first bill, deals with zoning. So as introduced, the bill would have eliminated any zoning requirements for private schools. Currently, public schools and charter schools are not required to go through a zoning process, and the private school sector wanted to also get that same authority. Again, like some of the other bills, there's traffic issues, there's a transparency component as well, and so we didn't agree with eliminating these requirements outright, but we were able to reach an agreement where the original ordinance that they had a problem with was an ordinance in Tucson that restricted actually required the schools to have a certain size to be located on more than an acre of land. So we eliminated that requirement so that that school in Tucson could move forward without upending all of our zoning process that we have for private schools currently.
All right, so we're going to skip a few slides here and talk about the first bill, one that we were glad failed to pass early on in the session, which was House Bill 2032, which would require that a party designation be printed on the ballots for local elections. So your mayor and council would all have to have a party designation. We felt like this was an obvious overreach from the state legislature trying to introduce partisanship into local elections, where cities and towns, the issues that they deal with potholes don't have a D or an R at the end of it. So, and in addition to that, there would be somewhat of a cost to this, because cities and towns would have to have a primary and a general election to seat their council and their mayor, regardless if there was an uncontested race. So we're glad that this failed to pass. The committee failed to pass early on in the process, so we're happy that this one did not move forward. The next one, 2116, this one kind of went under the radar a little bit. What this has to deal with is developers. What this bill would have done was limit a developer's liability to 8 years on projects that they had received a permit from the city or town. So if they're doing some sort of water project, it's not a CIP project, it's a project that they are constructing in the right-of-way, they've had to get a permit, and it's to serve one of their developments. They've turned around, and if they dedicated that to the city, from that time, their liability is limited to 8 years. What the problem is this bill came from a Supreme Court case, which was Glen Eyre v. City of Phoenix, which in that particular case, there was one construction worker that worked on a number of projects that had received a permit from the City of Phoenix. This particular worker had contracted mesothelioma, but did not, the symptoms did not manifest themselves until after the 8-year period, the 8-year statute of repose. So there was a lawsuit that was filed by the developer, or I'm sorry, the particular individual filed a lawsuit against the developers and the City of Phoenix, but as a condition for receiving a permit, the City of Phoenix requires that you indemnify the city of all third-party damages. So they filed a cross-claim within the Supreme Court saying that as a condition of receiving this permit, you agree to hold us harmless of any third-party claims. The court sided with Phoenix and determined that, yes, because of the rule of discovery and because it was a mesothelioma case, regardless if it happened within the 8-year period, the Phoenix's code can be enforced, and the developer has to indemnify the city. Now, if this bill had passed, that would be a particular issue for a lot of our communities, especially small communities, because mesothelioma cases are settled in the millions of dollars. And if a city ever had to defend itself in one of these cases, it would be financially disastrous. And all it would take is one case. And if you lost, that would be completely disastrous, particularly for a smaller community. We anticipate that there might be legislation next session on this matter, and so we're gonna keep an eye on it. The proponents of the legislation agreed to hold it off this session and agree to come talk with us in the interim about this issue. We've not heard from them yet, but we anticipate that this will come back up in the near future. Last bill on the list, photo radar. This is just the perennial photo radar ban. There's currently 6 cities remaining that still use photo radar enforcement. We anticipate that this issue would come up next year. Senate Bill 1262, dealing with assumed rate of return. This would have required PSPRS, EORP, and Corp plans to reduce their assumed rate of return from 7.4% to 4.7%, and that would have realized about a 27% increase in the contribution rates. Cities and towns would shoulder about almost $300 million of that, and this bill was put forward for no other reason than the sponsor felt that the 4.7% rate of return was a better reflection of the future market trends, but thus far we've not seen any data to support that moving it down that low is even necessary.
So for the sake of time, I'm just going to focus on the last bill here. As you can tell, these are the bad idea slides. As introduced, the bill would have allowed a homeowner to split their land, to subdivide their land, if the resulting parcels were as big as the average for the area. The problem is that once you split your land, you're lowering the average for the area, so then other people can continue to split their parcels. It didn't really have any rules for what requiring right of way or easement. It was really it wasn't really fully thought out, and so fortunately we were able to work with Representative Thorpe to rethink this, and that in the future, if he does decide that he wants to go down the parcel splitting route, that he'll work with us and the Planning Association to make sure that we're putting rules in place that don't adversely affect future land owners that decide to buy parcels, to make sure that they've been properly subdivided.
So we have about plus or minus 5 minutes left in this session, so we're going to skip some slides and breeze through some other ones. Again, if you happen to download the PDF or the PowerPoint and you do have questions, feel free to email us at the League and we'll try and answer any questions you might have. I'm going to turn it over to Alex just for the fire-related bills on this one.
In the 2 fire-related bills deal with requirements for fire sprinklers and for fire flow, so that's the amount of water pressure that you need to put out a fire. We require developers to ensure that there's enough water around so that one of their houses catches on fire, and we send out our firefighters, there's enough water there to put the fire out. Senator Allen and Senator Griffin are concerned with development up in northern Arizona and wanting to make it easier for developers to build out there. The problem is that we want to make sure that we're doing it in a safe manner. We're not putting the public at risk by not having enough water should there be a fire that breaks out up there. So we've been working with them, and hopefully in the future they'll be able to work with us and to come to an agreement. But really the issue is not having enough water up there. The issue, it's not about making it easier for developers. It's about making sure that there's enough water up in northern Arizona.
Okay, so I'm going to go over this one real fast. Public employee compensation cap for our small cities. This might not necessarily apply to you, but for our big cities, it's really important that they be able to attract talent, especially when it comes to a city manager and some of the public works folks. Representative Thorpe this year proposed a bill that would have limited, that basically would have placed a salary cap on public employees at $200,000. We opposed that, and the bill did die. Food producers, again, this was, for those of you that have been around for a while, this was kind of the chicken bill all over again. But it would have allowed folks that produce food products that were products of the soil. So this is fowl, swine, all these types of animals would have allowed them to have them on their property. Another one that's of interest to our small cities, I'm going to move along, is the county excise tax. This is actually to our counties, but it relates to our small and big cities alike. Am I on the right one? Yes. Okay. It relates to our small and big cities alike. This bill would have allowed 12 of our counties to go out for a half-cent excise tax for transportation. The other 3 counties, Pinal, Pima, and Maricopa, it would have allowed them to maintain the transportation excise tax that they already have. There's a lot of debate, especially in Maricopa County, about what that's going to look like. As it relates to East Valley, West Valley, light rail, all the buckets that we sort of put money into. This bill may or may not come back next session, but it is something that needs to be done in the relative near future because there's a lot of planning that needs to be done, especially in the Maricopa area, to decide what road projects we should work on. Real estate signs. This one's just interesting, so I'm gonna briefly talk about it. There was a case out of Gilbert called Reed versus Gilbert that said we can't regulate signs based on content. And that was a Supreme Court case. What this bill did, and it came from the real estate developers, is it allowed real estate, it came from the real estate agents, and it allowed real estate individuals to agents to put their signs in the right-of-way. Now, if you relate that back to Reed versus Gilbert, if real estate individuals can put their signs in the right-of-way, and we can't regulate based on content, then everybody can put their signs in the right-of-way. And so we opposed this piece of legislation, and much kudos goes to Senator Yarborough for helping take that down. HERF distributions, this is of particular interest to our small cities. This is a Representative Cook bill, and there was a carrot here in that cities under 7,500 in population, counties under 250,000 in population would have received additional HERF money. They would have skimmed $18 million off the top of growth, and they would have distributed that to small cities and counties, and then the rest would be dispersed to the larger cities, those above 7,500. We oppose this just on the principle that the Casa Grande Accord was negotiated over several years. It has been a scenario that has worked for most people. The issue is not with the Casa Grande Accord. The issue is with the fact that the gas tax hasn't been changed since 1991, and that the legislature has been sweeping HERF funds on and off since 1982. We don't believe that you solve the issue by creating another issue or taking money from large cities, but let's address the issues in other ways. We're going to go ahead and skip the rest of these. Again, like I said, if you have any questions, please reach out to any of us. I'm just going to touch on a few things real quick. The things that we're focused on next session are what are the elections going to look like. Everybody is talking about that. What is the makeup of the legislature? Currently it's 35-25 in the House and 17-13 in the Senate in favor of the Republicans. Will there be any change to that? And then who is going to be in leadership in either of these chambers? Impact on voter initiatives. There's been a lot of talk about some clean energy initiatives and some and the tax on those making more than $250,000 for education. So we'll see where that comes out. And we are particularly concerned about influence of anti-government groups out there. If you are interested in participating in our policy committees, if you are a council member or a mayor and you're interested in participating in our policy committees, we have these every year after the legislative session. Please notify the president of the executive committee about your request to be on the policy committee, and then you can be on policy committees and help have discussions on what legislation we might propose in future sessions. As for that, that's all we have. We'll be up here for a few minutes if any of you have any questions, and I know that there are some events at 4:30. One last thing for those of you that are attorneys and want that CLE certification, there has to be at least 5 of you. The forms are in the back. Go ahead and fill that out and take that with you.